Welcome to the webinar. We'll get started shortly. Before we begin, here's how to earn CPE credit. Unlike traditional CPE webinars, there are no polling questions or attendance checks during the presentation. Instead, you will demonstrate your knowledge by taking a brief multiple-choice quiz in the Earmark app. Search for the free Earmark app from the App Store or Google Play Store, or scan the QR code on the screen. Open the app and create an account. Be sure to use a valid email address because we'll email you your CPE certificates. From the home screen, scroll down to find the course. You can also tap the magnifying glass icon to search for the course. Tap on the course artwork, then the Enroll button. On the Course tab, you'll find the recording and quiz questions. If you don't see the quiz yet, don't worry. We'll email you when the quiz is available. Complete the quiz to earn your CPE certificate. If you have questions or need help, email us anytime at support@earmarkcpe.com. Now, on to the webinar.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Navigating the AICPA's New Quality Management Standards. My name's Joel and I'm from the Earmark team. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the comments section and we will get to that as soon as we can. And with that, I'll turn it over to today's hosts for today's webinar, Brian Yujuico and Chris Vanover.
Thanks so much, and thank you everyone for joining this webinar to learn about the AICPA's new quality management standards. So for those of you that I don't know, I'm Chris Vanover and I actually lead CPAClub. CPAClub is a US-based solution center that actually supports dozens of CPA firms and companies throughout the country in giving them access to our talented and experienced CPAs through a very flexible membership subscription model. Prior to CPAClub, I actually spent a combined 13 years with PwC, 4 of which were spent as a chief auditor in the National Quality Organization. And I also spent a few years with the public company Accounting Oversight Board, primarily working on the board's strategic initiatives, one of which was audit quality indicators. I also formerly served as an audit partner and director of quality control for a top 50 regional firm that was eventually acquired by Baker Tilly. Let me now let Brian introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. My name is Brian Yujuico. I'm vice president here at CPAClub. And this may sound like I'm repeating Chris, but similar to Chris, I spent about 12 years at PwC, with the last couple of years of my tenure there as a chief auditor in the National Quality Organization. And then after leaving PwC, I spent about 4 years at a large financial services company in a technical accounting role before joining CPAClub on a full-time basis here in this leadership role. So happy to be here today and we'll walk you through the elements of the new quality management standards.
Thanks, Brian. We're going to switch slides momentarily, but you'll see a standard disclaimer. And just wanted to remind you that much of the content being delivered today is factually based on the new quality management standards and resources developed and provided by the AICPA. So with that, we'll jump into the first slide regarding the learning objectives. I'm sure many of you know, and if you don't, the AICPA released new statements on quality management standards back in May of 2022, and those are required to be implemented by any firm with an audit and assurance practice by December of 2025. So believe it or not, that was already 20 months ago, and December of 2025 is just about 22 months away as we sit here now. So while that may seem far away, it really isn't, and there's a lot to do, as you'll see throughout this webinar. So today, our job here is to educate and inform you and provide you the awareness and tools that you need to hopefully successfully implement the new standards. We'll take you through how we got here with these new quality management standards, help you understand how to actually identify and assess quality risks, designing and implementing the responses to those risks that you've identified, and also share with you more about the steps you need to start taking to ensure you can comply with the new standards on time. So we'll switch gears one more slide if we could. And I think most of us that have been in this profession for a while have grown accustomed to and probably a little too comfortable with our resident existing quality control standards that we've had in place for a long time. Now, these new standards aren't simply a matter of dusting off your existing quality control manual or tweaking a few policies and procedures and then letting it out for everyone to acknowledge. So, considering all the headlines we continue to read about poor audit quality, whether it's from the Department of Labor or whether it's from the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, even in spite of a more robust peer review program and the PCAOB's continued efforts to drive improvement in audit quality, we continue to see that there's much more need to be done to improve audit quality through a more proactive approach. So these 4 new standards are actually designed to improve a CPA firm's risk assessment and audit quality and assurance quality and follow in the footsteps of the IAASB, our international counterparts, international standards on quality management. And these AICPA standards actually precede the PCAOB's forthcoming quality control standards. So you can see there's a lot of different 8 organizations in the mix here, all trying to do their part to help improve where we are from a professional standpoint when it comes to audit quality. And a lot of these standards, they'll make an effort to modernize quality control and really reflect new realities in practice. So think about the increased emphasis on a firm's risk assessment, changes in technology, and even the growing use of external service providers similar to us here at CPAClub. But these new standards are designed to create a scalable system that allows the firms to tailor their risk assessment based on their particular circumstances and the kinds of engagements that they conduct. But remember, if you're with a firm that performs any engagements under the standards you see on this slide, you are in fact impacted and required to actually implement these new AICPA quality management standards prior to December of 2025. So before Brian is going to dive into the details of SQMS number 1 and number 2, just want to give you a quick overview of the 4 standards that will go into effect. So the first one that a lot of you may have heard about is SQMS number 1, and that introduces the new risk-based process and requires firms to design, implement, and operate a system of quality management. Very similar to when companies back in the early 2000s had to actually abide by the new Sarbanes-Oxley Act and ultimately design, implement, and operate a system of internal controls that perhaps was a little bit put on the back shelf and deferred maintenance for a lot of those companies. That same concept is now really what's happening for CPA firms. SQMS number 2 will bring the focus to that ever important engagement quality review. And we continue to see in the firms that we support across the country, a lot of firms, not only because there's a shortage of talent, given that 75% of CPAs hit retirement age in 2020, but there's a general challenge with actually conducting a very effective engagement quality review. So we help a lot of firms in that area and actually help support firms by providing engagement quality review as a service for CPA firms. SAS 146 and SARS 26. This focuses on the quality management for the audits and the SARS services at the actual engagement level. So I've kind of given you a high-level overview. I'm going to pass the baton over to Brian, and he's going to spend some time walking all of us through the details and mechanics of these 4 new standards. So Brian, I'll turn it over to you.
Cool. Thanks, Chris. So as Chris mentioned, I'll go over some of the details behind the new standards. First, we'll just start off with this slide on SQMS number 1. Here displays the 8 components of the standard. And you'll see that I've highlighted 1 and 7 there. And these are indicative of the brand new components within the standard. The other 6, there is no change to the components itself, but there are new and required and revised requirements embedded within the updated standard. And so I'd like to really focus our time today on number 1, the risk assessment process. As Chris said, this is new to firms, and in my mind will be the heaviest lift in terms of implementation. And it's just not a lift and shift of your old quality control policies and procedures, but there is some actual thought and tailoring to your specific firms. And then we'll touch upon the other new and revised requirements and the other ones briefly. But again, we'll have maybe an couple examples and interactive activity to be able to understand the risk assessment process. So let's jump right into it. So what's new? So the risk assessment process. So this may look familiar to many of you. I liken this risk assessment process to what we have done in our day-to-day audit lives. When we plan an engagement, we're doing a risk assessment process and identifying risks and designing and implementing responses. Chris also mentioned Sarbanes-Oxley, which is a very similar process to what CPA firms will be required to do under the new standards, is really establish what the objectives are. So when you think about Sarbanes-Oxley, you need to establish some control objectives. Then you needed to identify what those risks were and then design the controls. So this is very similar to that same process that CPA firms will have to go through when implementing this. So as Chris mentioned, the risk assessment process is, an approach in designing, implementing, and operating a system of quality management. So the model was designed to help firms identify and address risks that is specific to their practice, and it creates a more scalable approach to quality for every type of firm out there. So with that said, the idea is it is specific to your practice. And as we have noticed with SAS 145 being effective for calendar year-end audits, we want to try to be as specific as we can in our engagements and identifying the risks and the specific responses. The same goes for the risk assessment process under the new quality management standards. We want to try to be as specific as possible to your firms and your firm's needs and practice. So step one at the top there is establishing quality objectives. So the requirement here is the firm needs to establish the desired outcomes relating to each of the 8 components of the SQM to be achieved by the firm. So again, you have to identify the quality objectives for each component, and we'll go through an exercise here shortly. There are standard quality objectives within the standard itself, but the idea again is to, as a firm, establish additional quality objectives that are specific to your firm. You may even think about establishing sub-objectives to enhance your identification and assessment of quality risks for your firm. So that's step one. Step two is identify and assess the quality risks. So the idea here is that you need to identify risks, and there is language in the standard as defining a risk that has a reasonable possibility of occurring and individually or in the combination with other risks adversely affecting the achievement of one or more quality objective. So again, we're not just throwing risks out there, but really thinking about what has a reasonable possibility of occurring and adversely affecting one or more quality objective. So with that said, you would need to understand certain things about your firm. Some things that are mentioned in the standard are, your operating characteristics of your firm, your strategic and operational decisions around business processes, business model of the firm, management leadership style, the particular laws and regulations in which the firm operates, your network of firms and network of services. Do you use third parties? Also, what types of engagements do you issue? Are you doing only audits, employee benefit plans, yellow book? So these are all things to consider when you're identifying the quality risks. One thing I'd like to point out is that when you establish your quality objectives, there's the idea of a risk is essentially the inverse of the quality objective. But again, the idea behind this risk assessment process is to be as specific and tailored as possible. So at the highest level, you can have a risk that is the inverse of the quality objective, and we'll go through an examples of that. But then you should really be taking the time to identify what specific risks are at a more granular level than just the inverse of the quality objectives. And then lastly, step 3 is design and implement responses. So as with our audit plan or in companies implementing SOX, They had to design audit procedures or design internal controls to address those risks that they identified. So for firms, these are the policies and procedures that would address the risks that were identified that would adversely affect your quality objectives. It is important to note that a response may address multiple quality risks. So you may implement one policy or procedure, and you can map that to various components and various risks that you have identified. So lastly, to close up this slide, you'll see at the bottom that this is not just a one and done exercise at the start of implementation. Just like in your audits, just like in implementing SOX, your business changes, right? And so you want to establish some policies or procedures to identify the need to make any modifications to either of these three steps, whether it be the objectives, the risks, or the responses. So there's an ongoing monitoring process that you have to essentially implement and ensure that changes to your business or your engagements are appropriately reflected in your system. So what I wanted to do now is go to the interactive portion, and we will go through some risk assessment examples to see exactly how this risk assessment process looks and feels. But I wanted to go through maybe just a test of the interactive portion and test the chat. So we'll be using the chat function. So as you can see, Chris and I are wearing our long sleeve CPAClub shirts or pullovers because it is a cold, frigid day here in Southern California. It is, when I woke up, it was a cold and frigid 55 degrees. And yes, that is cold for us. So maybe let's use the chat and see in what part of the country you are and what temperature it is where you are now. Just to have some fun, because I know I get made fun of a lot for having being bundled up when it's 55 degrees outside. All right, I see some activity in the chat. 70 degrees in Houston. Whew. 64, 52. So not bad. That's really cold for us. My hands are cold. South Carolina. I see a couple of South Carolinas there. Bay Area. All right. Oh, there's a few South Carolinas. Okay. Oslo, 2 degrees Celsius. Wow. Okay. So I'm getting some activity there. So what we're going to do now is use that chat function. And we're going to have 5 examples that we'll walk through. And essentially, this is how you go through the risk assessment process. So step 1 is by each component, you need to identify quality objectives, quality risks, and then the responses to those risks. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to give you a multiple choice on what you think the more appropriate response to the quality risks here is. And to make it even more interactive and ensure there's more attention being given, the multiple choice slide does not have the prompt here. So you're going to have to read this, use some sort of memorization, and then decide what answer is the most appropriate. So for risk assessment example 1, we have our component of governance and leadership. You have your objective of leadership demonstrates a commitment to quality through its actions and behaviors. Your risk is professionals in leadership positions prioritize economic gain over quality through their actions and behaviors. So I left the response to this risk blank. And what we'll do is I have 2 choices here of what you think the more appropriate response is to that risk. So go ahead and use the chat function and put A or B and see what you think. Maybe I'll go back. There we go. So again, here's your risk. Professionals in leadership positions prioritize economic gain over quality through their actions and behaviors. And go ahead, use the chat function to say, what is the more appropriate response to that quality risk? Okay, getting a few answers in the chat. See a couple B's. So let's go through and see. So professionals in leadership positions, again, the risk, prioritize economic gain over quality through their actions and behaviors. So the more appropriate response, and not to say that response B is not correct. Again, you can have multiple responses address multiple risks and vice versa. So in this instance, policies are in place to prohibit placing economic gain over quality, and leadership is evaluated annually, and standardized evaluation prioritize quality over financial and operational metrics. I see in the chat you're tempted to put both, and yeah, that's part of the process, and part of why we're going through this exercise is to show that there can be multiple responses, there can be multiple risks, multiple objectives, and multiple responses to risks that you can map to particular risks. So just like in your audit, just like in a controls assessment, you can say a control addresses the same assertion for a particular risk, and you can map that control to multiple risks. So good. Let's move on to the next one. So I'll give you a second to read the prompt. So again, we're going into another component on relevant ethical requirements. Right, the risk. The firm and its personnel fail to fulfill their responsibilities in relation to the relevant ethical requirements to which the firm and the firm's engagements are subject. So here's a couple of proposed responses to that risk. And go ahead and use the chat function again. Okay, we're getting a couple answers in here. A, B, A, B, A. So A is the suggested solution. The firm obtains written confirmation upon hire and at least annually of compliance and with its policies and procedures regarding relevant ethical requirements from all required personnel. So again, if you look at the B, for those that chose B, the firm requires sufficiently experienced engagement team members to identify matters for consultation or consideration during the engagement. So yes, it may indirectly address the risk, but again, back to our point on example number 1, you can have multiple responses mapped to various risks across different components. And again, not to belabor the point, but you can see that this can be a time-consuming exercise because you're actually putting some thought into what are the specifics around your firm, what policies and procedures are in place, or where do you have gaps that you need to put policies and procedures in place? And then going through that mapping exercise to actually say, hey, do these responses address these risks? Okay. So let's move on to another one. Let's hit on another component around acceptance and continuance of client engagements. So there's your quality objectives, which are pretty standard. Quality risks, again, can be standard, the inverse, or they can be specific. But engagement partner makes inappropriate judgments about whether to accept or continue a client relationship or specific engagement based on financial and operational priorities. Okay, take a look at that. See a couple A's in here. A, okay. So I got lots of A's. So the risk here about an engagement partner making inappropriate judgments about whether to accept or continue a client relationship. Your response is to have policy and procedures in place to prohibit someone from accepting or continuing a client relationship based on inappropriate and financial or operational priorities. So that part is very standard in addressing the risk specifically, but this specific example has kind of a particular add-on. So a newly developed standardized acceptance and continuance form is now completed, and all engagements requiring an EQR or EQR sign-off needs to have an EQR sign off on the acceptance or continuance of that engagement. So again, this is a more than just a plain standard response, but something that's new and incremental to address the quality risk displayed here.
Yeah, and Brian, I'll just add to that. I think in our workings with different CPA firms, a number of which are either going through a PCAOB remediation or even looking for help with AICPA peer review support, oftentimes when there is, perhaps a corrective action coming out of peer review or an actual finding coming out of the PCAOB inspection process, the PCAOB and even peer review have started to ask questions around, well, what was your initial gatekeeper and why did your acceptance continuance process allow this engagement to make its way through the system? And was that perhaps the underlying root cause of some of these audit deficiencies? So there is a much more emphasis, no different than trying to implement these new quality management standards, much more of an emphasis on proactive measures to help ensure that the right clients are actually brought into the door before anything else.
Yep, exactly, Chris. And if you go back to here, someone was saying, maybe B was a little bit more arbitrary. Again, yes, that's correct. It's a little bit more arbitrary, but again, that leadership tone at the top about communication, and that may feed in indirectly into this risks about maybe there needs to be firm communication and tone at the top that partners should not just be going after any engagement just for economic gain. That leadership has established a tone at the top to say, hey, no, we need to do our diligence and understand what are our procedures in place to be able to accept or continue a client engagement.
And those examples of actually rejecting possible clients actually provides really great evidence to show that that particular policy or response from a quality objective perspective is actually an effect and working the right way.
Yeah. All right. So we have a couple more examples here. So here's number 4. You're going into the engagement performance component. You can read the objective and the risk. So here it looks like our quality objective is a generic, the quality risk is the inverse of our objective about having engagement documentation not being assembled on a timely basis. So here's a couple of proposed responses to those risks. And I'll be monitoring the chat. So A or B, remember this is around the engagement documentation not being assembled on a timely basis. Okay, got a couple A's. All right. So yes, that seems to be pretty straightforward about having a policy in place about, when engagement files are to be assembled and finalized. But also look at this second sentence about the quality partner, or that the person charged with quality for the firm reviews a master list of engagement every quarter for compliance of all engagements. So again, you're addressing maybe the risk, but also having that bigger picture in mind around what's really the risk, not only for a particular engagement, but for the firm's overall quality system.
Yeah, and we've again seen specific examples of this where the regulators have actually fined firms for failing to maintain appropriate archive policies around work papers and ultimately delivering those within a certain time frame after the report release date. So, it may sound like, oh, this is far-fetched for your firm, but this does happen in reality every single day for different firms throughout the US.
All right. This is the last one on resources. So as you can see by reading the quality objective, this is more of a tailored objective to a firm that's specifically doing government audits and employee benefit plan audits. All right, it may look as if it's a standard objective, but again, the idea behind the whole risk assessment is that it's scalable and specifically related to your firm's practice. So here's the quality risk. They do not have the appropriate CPE required by government and the Employee Benefit Plan Audit Quality Center. So here are some proposed responses. Go ahead. See a couple of B's in here coming up. BBB, good. So you'll see that B, yes, it's very specific in addressing the risk that firm personnel do not have the government or benefit plan related CPE. So you can tell by the response to that risk that this is a very tailored response, right? About a firm requiring all personnel to obtain 4 to 8 per quarter, both related to government and EBP auditing and accounting, as well as this, if you look at the second sentence, tracking through a new CPE digital tracking system and monitored quarterly by the firm's newly designated CPE administrator. So a lot going on in the response there, right? So you have a requirement for personnel, you have a tracking system, and you also now have a newly designated CPE administrator within the firm to ensure compliance. So again, this is very tailored to a firm that does government and EBP audits, and you're addressing the objectives, the risks, as well as the response to fit that. So I hope that's helpful. And again, not to belabor the point, but as you can tell, it took some time to just think through some of the responses and whether it made sense or not. And the idea is, again, tailor this to your firm's specific circumstances. And then really you have to go through this exercise of saying, what's in place in our current system? Where do we have gaps? And then putting those new policies and procedures in place to address those gaps if there are gaps. Okay, so a time-consuming exercise, but this is the heaviest lift of the new quality management standards. Next, I will go into some of the other aspects or other components and quickly touch upon the different changes and updates within those. So I think the new component, along with the risk assessment process, was on information and communication. So the purpose of the information and communication component is addressing the importance of communicating the information obtained, generated, and used both within the firm and to external parties on a timely basis regarding the design, implementation, and operation of your firm's system of quality control. So this component underscores the importance of a continuous flow of information that's communicated from the top down. So we've mentioned this in kind of our examples, and it's all about the tone at the top. Leadership is the CEO or managing partner is charged with being overall responsibility for the firm's quality. And that flow of information should be driven from top down through all aspects of the firm, as well as to external parties when needed. So there is also an idea of establishing an information system with processes to help identify, capture, process, and maintain the information related to your system's quality of controls. But again, the standard is flexible in that it's scalable to firms of different sizes. So it is understandable that firms that are smaller, maybe less complex with fewer personnel, may have less rigorous or detailed policies and procedures or information systems in place. So again, it's scalable to your firm's size and circumstances. Lastly, the part of this is around the information about being transparent to external parties. This component requires that firms establish policies and procedures that address when communications to external parties such as regulators, peer reviewers, network firms are appropriate. And this is to promote, continual innovation in this area. And really it provides you flexibility what type of information you are communicating to external parties. But it is expected that you have this monitoring of your information system and how you're communicating, and you're continually innovating that process. So moving on to what's not new, but has changed. So if you recall on one of the first slides, we had the 8 components, and 6 of those components are not net new, but have aspects that have changed within. So I'll briefly touch upon that. So from a governance and leadership perspective, again, the idea is to create this internal culture based on the recognition that quality is essential in performing engagements. And that starts with the tone at the top and assessing qualifications of leadership and holding leadership accountable. So that's key. There's got to be a mechanism, policies and procedures in place where leadership partners, engagement partners, engagement quality reviewers are being held accountable for quality. So I mentioned this previously, but the standard requires to assign ultimate responsibility for the system of a firm to the CEO or the managing partner equivalent. And then lastly, the organizational structure, you are supposed to assign resources to show your commitment to the execution and monitoring of your system of quality of control. As we move into the relevant and ethical requirements, this encompasses all regulatory ethical requirements and requires consideration of network firms and service providers. So again, in the state of our profession, where there is a shortage of talents, we have gone to third-party service firms such as ourselves at CPAClub that help execute your engagements as well as your system of quality management or control. But the idea here is that you are holding those external parties as if they were your own staff in terms of all relevant ethical requirements, including independence. Your external parties are abiding by your policies and procedures related to those topics. Next, as we move into acceptance and continuance, we've had a couple of examples of those in our risk assessment process, but the emphasis here is, are firms able, based on your capabilities, able to accept or continue on an engagement, depending on the circumstances, also ethical considerations, and then most importantly, we are not prioritizing financial gain or economic gain over the quality of the engagement. And then lastly, engagement performance. This emphasizes the role of the engagement partner as responsible for the quality of the engagement and has to be involved sufficiently throughout the audit, not just on the bookends at the start and then at the finish, but throughout the engagement. It emphasizes the supervision, review, and professional skepticism considerations. And then lastly, the requirements related to the engagement quality reviewer have been moved to a new statement standard, which is SQMS No. 2, which we'll touch upon briefly.
And Brian, I'll just maybe jump in for one point in particular around the concept of the resources that you're mentioning here. And before you get into the details here, think about in today's age where we know there's an extreme shortage of CPAs and talented people to actually execute the procedures. A lot of firms are now at that point where they're turning away work, and that's actually the right thing to do if you don't actually have the time or resources to do it. And in the event you choose not to turn it away, you really need to step back and ask yourself, do I actually have the bandwidth within our firm to actually execute this and ensure that we have the competence and the capabilities to do so? And that doesn't necessarily mean driving your people from a 60-hour work week to a 75-hour work week to get it done. We know that there is diminishing returns when it comes to a certain level of quality, and the hours impact that. So really you have to kind of do a gut check here and really think about whether you're actually equipped to handle these engagements.
Yep, exactly right. Which is a good segue into this next component on resources. So a key change from the previous quality control standards to the current quality management standards is the component has changed from human resources to resources in general. So that includes not only human, but technological, intellectual, even methodology is a resource that is to be considered under this component. So overall, this is obtaining, developing, using, maintaining, allocating, and assigning all those types of resources that I just said in a timely manner in order to design, implement, and operate your system of quality management. Basically addresses all the resources that a firm needs to operate a system and to perform engagements with quality in mind. Some other things that I'd like to point out here are that there's a new requirement that firms hire people or personnel with the competence and capability to carry out the system. And I alluded to this earlier, usually a quality control partner or director is in charge of overseeing the system. And then lastly, as Chris just mentioned, in a time where we have a shortage of talent, there is a requirement to obtain external resources if the firm does not have sufficient personnel to either one, carry out the engagements, and two, more importantly, is to carry out its system of quality of control. So again, CPAClub, we're here as an example of we offer both to kind of offering engagement assistance as well as operating your system of quality of control or quality management. And then lastly, you have your monitoring and remediation. Not too many changes there, but really tailoring your monitoring activities, which is consistent with the theme of tailoring specific to your firm's circumstances and practice. But there is an emphasis here on to perform your monitoring on an ongoing basis, and if findings are resulting from your monitoring process, you need to have a framework for evaluating those findings, including the assessment of root causes. So for those of you that are familiar with the controls, and when you have a control deficiency, you have to go through a root cause analysis and decide what was the root cause of why that control failed. Similar here, if your responses or your controls, your internal controls failed, you have to come up with a assessment of the root cause. So quickly moving on to SQMS 2, as I mentioned in 2 slides ago, the concept of the engagement quality review has moved to its own standard, so SQMS 2, and this addresses both the appointment and the eligibility of the engagement quality reviewer and the performance of the quality reviewer. So this only applies when a firm decides that an engagement quality review is appropriate based on an appropriate response to a quality risk. So it addresses the eligibility of an EQR, as well as what the engagement quality reviewer should be doing as part of their responsibilities. And this is more prescriptive than previous EQR requirements. And those in the PCAOB space, you may recognize the EQR requirements here. It's very aligned to what the PCAOB has for its EQR standard. So from an eligibility requirement standpoint, you got to consider threats to objectivity, but there is no cooling off period for EQRs. You must allow, just as with engagement partners, you must allow the EQR sufficient time to perform. You just can't have the EQR come in on the 12th hour and sign off on all the file and the binder and release the report. You need to allow sufficient time, and it's best practice to have the EQR involved from the very start to the end, just as if you were treating that person as the engagement partner. And then lastly, there's permitted use of external parties and assistants to perform EQRs, such as another plug for CPAClub, where we do perform EQRs for other member firms. Lastly, the performance of an EQR. The focus should be on significant matters and significant judgments made by the engagement team. A stand back requirement is specifically stated in the standard, and you are required as an EQR to maintain objectivity from the engagement team and not to be making any significant judgments on behalf of the engagement team. So that is an overall summary of SQMS 2 on engagement quality reviews. And then this slide here, really a couple updates. So Chris mentioned this before, but SAS 146 really updates the quality management standards, the new quality management standards to be implemented at the engagement level. And then SARS number 26, this basically applies the same SQMS standards to financial statement reviews under those standards. So with that said, I'll turn the baton back over to Chris, and he will go for some of the closing considerations here as we approach implementation date.
Brian, thanks. That was a pretty helpful deep dive into the new standards, especially around SQMS number 1 and how to think about quality risk and how do you craft specific responses that address those identified risks that are actually tailored to a particular firm. So I know all of us, it's January 31st. Most of us here are probably in the throes of the start of busy season. So if that's not already scaring you, I think this slide here will scare you on top of that. We actually saw this slide back in May of 2022 at the AICPA Engage conference in Las Vegas when they first introduced the new quality management standards. And this slide actually shows us a possible phased approach to implementing the new quality management standards by considering one component at a time, and then at the end, reconsidering the risk assessment, the gap analysis, and the responses to the quality risks. But this was released back in May of 2022, and obviously we're now here at the beginning of basically February of 2024. So if you haven't already started, you're likely going to start to feel some compression, okay? But just by being here today, you're at least starting the process to understand, and you just now may need to do it a little faster than had you started this when the new standards were announced. So at this point for our CPA firm members, we're actually recommending an accelerated approach by seeking to possibly address at least 2 of the 8 components of SQMS number 1 each quarter this year, and then begin calendar year 2025 by turning the focus to SQMS number 2, as well as SAS 146 and SARS 26. Now, again, that's an extremely accelerated timetable. It will only get more and more accelerated as you obviously enter into the coming months. So I guess the question that's probably on a lot of your mind is, what do we do? And so let's turn the slide here and just talk about some of the actions that you should be taking. This is going to give you a good idea of what actions you need to take and some of those details behind those actions. So please feel free to use this as a takeaway. But first, like I said before, you've got to understand the standards, and there's no substitute for reading the standards. There's a number of great resources published by the AICPA that will help you gain insights, knowledge, as well as various webcasts and webinars and CPE courses just like this one that we're doing here today. But if you haven't already, time really is of the essence to start developing the implementation plan. The key with this plan is making sure that there is clear ownership and a commitment from leadership to get this done, okay? And we've been in conversations with different CPA firms where there's a complete disconnect between the managing partner and ultimately maybe the line partners and even the quality control directors that want to try to move forward on this. And they're getting pushback from managing partners who don't want to devote the dollars or the resources to getting this done. That ultimately has to change in order to make effective progress with respect to the implementation timeline. We know this is especially challenging in the midst of busy season. We know there's the talent crisis. Okay, we hear from our members pretty much every single day that demand is clearly exceeding supply. Busy seasons are only getting longer, unfortunately, and retaining people continues to be an uphill battle. So you really need to think about whether you and your team have upwards of possibly 400 hours to spend on this initiative without losing focus on everything else to give these standards the attention they deserve. If you don't know what to do, okay, similar to your clients implementing the new revenue recognition or lease standards, or even back to the dawn of SOX 404, you're likely going to call in some help to guide you to the finish line, just like our team here at CPAClub can do for firms. We can work behind the scenes. Other service providers out there can do the same, but ultimately set yourselves up for success by continuing to make progress on this behind the scenes while you prioritize managing your existing ongoing client relationships, getting your existing audits, reviews, compilations out the door. Just don't underestimate the level of effort involved in performing the risk assessment the right way, in getting through that gap analysis and really preparing the documentation to actually comply with these new standards. And, again, once you're at that finish line, it unfortunately doesn't stop there, right? Because that's when you have to shift and you have to start evaluating the new system of quality management and establishing that more robust process for ongoing monitoring and remediation. So I'll leave you with my final point here is this is an actual investment and a commitment that you and your firm have to make to the profession, and you want to make sure you're doing it the right way. I think that's all I wanted to say on the take action slide here. Brian, I don't know if we have any specific other items on the agenda other than just going through our contact information.
Nope, just our contact information here, and then scan the QR code for more information on CPAClub. But I think I will turn it over back to Joel from Earmark to close it on out.
Thank you, Brian and Chris, for today's webinar, and thank you to all of our attendees. If you're interested in earning CPE, keep an eye out for an email in the next few days. It will contain instructions on how to take a short quiz through the Earmark app. If you have any questions or concerns, please email support@earmark.com and enjoy the rest of your day.
Today's webinar has ended. We hope you enjoyed it. To earn CPE for watching, download the free Earmark app. Scan the QR code on the screen to visit the download page. Open the app and create your account. Use a valid email address where you will receive CPE certificates. Then register for the course. You can search for it by tapping on the magnifying glass icon on the home screen and then entering the name of this webinar. If you're attending the live stream of this webinar, keep an eye out for an email letting you know when the quiz is available in the next few days. Pass the quiz to earn your CPE credits. Then tap the button to email yourself a CPE certificate. Stay tuned for more webinars from Earmark. We appreciate you joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.